I did not grow up on a farm, and I did not grow up in a forest. I grew up in the suburbs. And it's actually thought that these children in between the cities and the fields actually have less exposure to the natural world. But I had two things. The first was my father. I watched as he spent long winters thoughtfully planting his garden. I have spent countless hours touring his beautiful gardens. I will admit, sometimes begrudgingly in high school when we had to discuss the latest tulips that had just bloomed before I could get the keys to the car. But it worked. He planted a seed in me, and eventually it took root, and it grew. The second was an apple tree. While living in the high desert of New Mexico, there was an apple tree that grew directly outside the window of my casita. I was able to watch it intimately as it shifted through the seasons, buds that burst into blooms, blooms that were met with the buzzing of pollinators, fruit that set and grew ripe right before my eyes. Watching this apple tree shifted my perspective and changed the way I viewed the world. It was then that I learned that if I paid attention to nature, there were so many lessons that it held for me. And one of the first lessons I learned from the natural world was that in order to grow, we must first find our place. The places we come to know best are the ones we call home, and everyone has one. Whether solitary or communal, bees have hives, ants have colonies, foxes have dens, birds weave nests unique to their species, turtles have shells, and trees grow roots that hold them in place. What makes us different is with our human experience, we actually form bonds with the places that we live. These bonds have actually been called our sixth sense, our sense of place. The way our surrounding environment becomes intrinsically tied to who we are. Place shapes the way we view the world. And it may seem hard to believe at a time when, at our fingertips, we can literally call a global village. We are actually becoming at risk of losing touch with the places we call home. My hope today is to leave you determined to discover the lessons you can uncover when you let nature guide you and teach you how to grow in place. Now, as I first started to grow in place, I realized one of the first questions I had was how to define my home. I knew that my apple tree stood firmly in one place, but I could move around. Where did my home begin, and where did it end? The answer to this question came in recognizing that my new neighborhood had some very important boundaries. You see, it was also in the high desert that I began to recognize that water is such an incredibly valuable resource. And I learned that in nature, the boundaries of place are defined by the resources they contain. The most tangible definition of this boundary for this resource is a watershed. The physical features of the landscape around us that shape the pathways where our water flows. I came to recognize that my home was my watershed, and that the boundaries of my watershed formed the borders of my home. And when I came to define it like this, I was able to recognize that our borders really connect us more than they divide us. Because the pathways of water, the lakes and streams, the rivers and streams, they become like living threads that tie and weave our watersheds to each other. The most beautiful thing about this definition I came to recognize is that when you define place like this, nature is accessible to everyone. Whether you live in the city or the country or somewhere in between, all you have to do is step outdoors into your watershed and you are instantly connected to everything else around you. The most beautiful thing about connecting with place in that way is that once you start to look closely around you and paying attention, you become connected to the things that you see. When you look closely at the cycles and changes around you, you can call yourself a phenologist. And I think that sounds really professional because you're practicing the science of phenology. The poet Mary Oliver said that attention is the beginning of devotion. And indeed, meaningful connections with place begin with the simple act of paying attention. When you start to pay attention, you recognize that this wild world around us is actually founded on routine. The sun rises and sets in the same direction each day. The earth circles the sun, giving us our seasons. And the moon orbits the earth, displaying its phases. These routines become key parts of our human existence. They tie us to place. And when we begin to develop meaningful connections with them, spring is no longer defined by a date on the calendar. We come to know spring as when the red-winged blackbirds return with their distinctive trill. I know it's summer when the first strawberries are ripe. And I know we've reached the cusp of fall when the monarchs prepare to leave their milkweed and head their journey south. I wonder what connections you have that remind you of the season shifting, and I'm curious, are they memories that you conjure from your childhood? Every time we allow nature to take our breath away, fill us with awe, comfort us, or make us wonder, we are developing our sense of place. And it is in those times that we let nature fill us with wonder that we can begin to unlock the lessons that nature holds. It was Socrates who said that wisdom begins in wonder. And I know that every scientist will agree that every good discovery begins with an I wonder question. Now, I recognize that we don't all remain as susceptible to wonder. I know my husband will agree that we can't all run outside expressing our sheer delight every time the sandhill cranes pass overhead in migration. But I want to remind you that this wonder is something innate in you. It was a seed that was planted in your childhood, and it is a tool that can be cultivated to connect you or perhaps reconnect you to place. And I want to promise you that this practice of cultivating your sense of wonder is so much fun, and it's so easy. All you have to do is spend time outside, pay attention, and start to ask questions. Simple questions like, why is there a frog in my flower? And all of a sudden you begin to understand that these neighbors that we share our neighborhood with are truly amazing. This is the part I love the most because I'm reminded that nature has been around for a really long time, designing solutions and coming up to answers to problems we may not even know we have yet. So I'm going to share with you some of my neighbors in my watershed. When I began to wonder about them, I learned some incredible things. The first is the black-capped chickadee. When I wondered how this tiny bird survived all winter long, I was astounded to discover that in late summer it actually grows the portion of its brain responsible for spatial memory. This is how it remembers, where it stashes every little tiny seed to keep it alive all winter long. And when I wondered what that first croaking sound that I heard in early spring was, I discovered it's most likely a wood frog. And the reason why is because when all of the other amphibians crawl far beneath the frost line to stay warm during the winter, the wood frog stays in place. Its body essentially produces an antifreeze protecting its organs, and it freezes through like an ice cube, spending the winter in a state of torpor on the forest floor. So it's the first to come alive when the temperatures rise. The skunk cabbage essentially does the opposite. In a process called thermogenesis, it actually creates its own heat and grows through the snow. Now, this funky hooded flower is one of the first things to bloom, and it happens long before pollinators like bees that you and I think of are around. So what it does is it emits an incredible stink to call the first hatches of flies and beetles to pollinate it. And the Luna moth is quite possibly one of my favorites. Their lifespan is so short, they are born with no mouths or digestive systems. They have one purpose, to find their mate by the light of the moon, and they don't have long to do it. And in order to do this, their tails are not just for decoration. They are designed to disrupt the sonar of the bats that are hunting them. These are the things that fill me with awe, inspire me, and make me wonder every time I am outside. These are the things that humble me and remind me that the more I learn, the less I know. And in order to make these discoveries, we have to spend time outdoors. Yes, we can learn them in books or online, but I argue that the experiences are so much richer when we can touch them. I'm sure you've heard there are so many studies telling us that it's good for our health to spend time outside. Yet at the same time, children today are spending less time outdoors than ever before. And it is those children in the middle, the children in the suburbs that have less exposure to unstructured, exploratory play in the natural world. And these are the places where wonder creeps in. This is where they will begin to build their sense of place. This is where they create those memories that they will carry with them from their childhood. It was the place-based educator, David Sobel, who said, "We must teach our children to love the earth before we ask them to save it." I would like to suggest that we are doing our children a great disservice when at the same time we set them outdoors, that we are overburdening them with stories of the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in. When their first exposures to nature are partnered with the perils of deforestation, pollution, and the threat of extinction and climate change, we are not teaching them to connect with place. We are frightening them and teaching them that the world is too fragile and too dangerous to explore. When we teach our children to fall in love with the places around them, that is how we will come to successfully steward this place, this collective neighborhood, this planet we call home. And so I leave you today with a call to action. I want you to get outside. And I don't want you to do it just today. I want you to make a habit of it. I want you to step outside and discover your watershed. I want you to find your apple tree. And when you do, I ask that you take a child with you. Not only because they ask the very best I wonder questions, but I want you to encourage them to fall deeply in love. It was the environmentalist Rachel Carson that said, if each child is to keep alive his inborn sense of wonder, he needs the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with him the joy, the excitement, and the mystery of the world we live in. Just as my father did for me, we must plant those seeds of wonder and encourage them to grow. Because when we spend time outdoors, we not only grow in place, but we have the potential to grow wise, learning from this incredible earth that we share. Thank you.